What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
The waiter had just slid the still warm dessert menus across the linen when my daughter, in a dress I had steamed before sunrise and heels she could barely walk in without wobbling like a newborn foal pretending to be a racehorse, lifted her glass, tapped it with the kind of authority you see in people who think the microphone loves them by default, and said in a voice sweet enough to make strangers look up from their creme brulee that I did not belong there and that I had done nothing for her. A line so rehearsed it came out like the closing sentence of a courtroom drama, clean, sharp, and begging for applause from people who did not know how many nights I spent learning the smell of burning coffee because the overnight shift on the third floor always ran cold. I did not gasp, and I did not correct the record, because the record had not been invited. I set my napkin down, felt the sting crackle behind my eyes like a bad fluorescent bulb that refuses to die, and let a single clap break the air. Soft and deliberate, a one-woman standing ovation that made the table flinch and the couple at the window turn their heads as if the restaurant had sprouted a fire alarm with manners. And then I smiled in the way you smile at a badly trained dog that has finally dropped the shoe, not because it learned anything but because it ran out of fun. She went on, because people who confuse performance with power usually do, thanking her father's side for their guidance even though their guidance had mostly been an annual card with a signature that looked hammered together at the airport bar, blessing her professors with language pulled straight from the brochure, and then lifting her chin toward me with a pitying shrug small enough to pass for grace if you sat far away, and I watched relatives nod as if disagreements could be solved by agreeing with the loudest person in the room, while the server hovered like a hummingbird who had stumbled into a debate and just wanted to deliver the check to the person least likely to bite. What I wanted, in the heat of it, was to throw open the doors and let the night air flood the table with the smell of the parking lot and freedom, yet I kept my voice low and, even when I stood, touched the stem of my water glass with 2 fingers, and said that it was a beautiful thing to watch someone claim their victory, because victory without humility ages the face faster than cigarettes, and then I thanked the kitchen, because a meal that good deserves honesty, and finally I toasted the future without naming who had paid for its past, and the room let out a polite ripple of sound that traveled halfway and died, like a wave that hit a wall it did not see coming. She rolled her eyes, the way she used to when I said seatbelts were not a suggestion, and the table scattered into side conversations about internships and city rents, and which rooftop bar photographs best. While I eased back into my chair and let the noise float above me like balloons I had no obligation to catch, and when the check came in its little leather envelope with a pen tucked inside like a promise that someone still believed in signature magic, I took it first and did a thing that made the server blink, because I signed my name, left a tip that would make the staff argue over who loved me most, and asked that the receipt be placed, folded once, by the bread plate of the young woman who had just announced to a room full of witnesses that I was a ghost in her success story, not out of spite, but because ceremony matters, and the bill was the only stage left that evening where facts still counted. On the walk to the parking lot, she drifted 3 steps ahead of me with her friends, laughing the laugh people use when they have won the point and need the world to hear it, and I let the night close around my shoulders like a jacket I could finally afford. And while she posed against the hood of someone else's car for a photo that would be cropped to look intimate and hard-won, I sat in my seat, closed the door with the gentleness I save for glass, and watched her through the windshield, that familiar silhouette of the girl who used to ask me to check under the bed for monsters now feeding the monsters with compliments and borrowed bravado, and I felt the strangest relief, because the target she had painted on me at dinner had also painted a door. And doors are useful when you are done with a room. At home the house exhaled the way houses do when you close the day behind you, and in the quiet that followed I brewed coffee I did not need, because old habits are the friendliest ghosts, opened the drawer where I keep the things that have kept us afloat, and took out the folder with the passwords I learned to guard the way other women guard secret recipes. Then I sat at the kitchen table under the crooked light and logged into the account with her name on it, the one I had fed for years by skipping new tires and pretending that the squeal was music, and I watched the numbers like a doctor watches a monitor, steady, indifferent, certain they had a job to do that did not include gratitude. There is a kind of calm that arrives when you stop arguing with gravity, and it sat with me while the website blinked and asked whether I was sure, as if certainty were a luxury someone like me could not possibly afford, and I moved the cursor. Read the line about transfers and holds and the difference between education as investment and education as entitlement, and I clicked through the steps not with anger, but with a clarity so clean it felt like cold water, then typed the message field that allowed for notes, the space where you can put meaning without sending an essay, and I wrote 2 words that fit the ledger like a key fits a lock, set the status the way I needed it set, and closed the laptop with a softness that felt like mercy disguised as steel. When the house had settled and the coffee sat untouched and the night leaned into its last hour, I took a blank index card from the drawer, the kind I use for grocery lists and emergency phone trees, and the names of plumbers who show up on time. And I wrote the same 2 words with the cheap black pen that never dies because life is funny like that. Then I slipped the card into an envelope and, before the ink could dry, tucked the envelope into the pocket of the jacket she likes to borrow. Without asking, because tomorrow she would wake up and find it and the world would be rearranged in a way you can only describe as honest, and as I turned off the kitchen light I understood that I had not raised a child to like me, I had raised a child to learn. And that sometimes the lesson needs a quiet room and a closed door to echo properly. In the morning, before the sun had decided what kind of day it wanted to be, my phone began its bright little dance across the nightstand as if it had legs, insistent and needy, and I let it move, because messages can wait when the truth cannot. And by the time I poured water over coffee grounds, I could already picture her hand sliding into that jacket pocket, pulling out the envelope, opening it with the impatience of someone who believes everything good will arrive overnight, and then reading the 2 words I had chosen like a verdict and a map, while somewhere in a server farm the account did exactly what I told it to do, and if you think my clap at dinner was loud, you should hear the sound a silence makes when it finally takes center stage. I did not answer the first call or the 5th or the 20th, because answering would have given her a shape to push against, and I wanted her to feel the shape of consequences instead. So I let the phone keep up its frantic little parade while the coffee drip stuttered and the morning news muttered from the television about rents rising and internships not paying and parents sending care packages stuffed with nostalgia, and I thought about how many nights I had counted tips in the pantry with my shoes still on because sitting down meant not getting back up, and how many forms I had filled out with the kind of concentration people associate with bomb squads. Because financial aid is just a different kind of wiring that demands you sweat and hold your breath and pray you cut the right line first. By the time sunlight made a half-hearted appearance through the kitchen blinds, the missed calls had stacked like crooked books, and the first message arrived with the kind of punctuation people use when they mean business, but forgot their manners, telling me that the tuition portal was acting strange and that her payment history had disappeared and that the landlord would not hold her apartment past Friday without verification of the next term, and then another message followed in which she mentioned that friends were planning a celebratory trip that weekend and it would be embarrassing to explain why she could not book, and I stood there, mug warming my hands, and let the words pass through me like rain through a screen. Not because I enjoyed her panic, but because panic is sometimes the only honest language entitlement understands when it runs out of applause. What people never tell you about raising a child mostly alone is that the ledger you keep is not just money and minutes, it is also dignity surrendered in little receipts. The field trip you chaperoned after a double shift where you smiled through the smell of cafeteria pizza because your kid wanted you there. The winter coat bought on clearance in August, because that is when the good sizes hide. The dentist appointments negotiated like hostage trades with an office that wants a card on file you hope will clear, and as I listened to my voicemail convert her voice into text with the accuracy of a gossip columnist, I felt the old ache of being measured by people who only show up for the ribbon cutting. And I reminded myself that I had not chosen silence to hurt her. I had chosen it because the truth needed room to speak without my voice softening it into a lullaby she could ignore. Around mid-morning the relatives kicked in like a chorus line that had been waiting for their cue, each with a take dressed in concern but hemmed with accusation, telling me that the dinner scene had been unfortunate, but I should not take things so personally. That a young woman finding herself says dramatic things and that mothers should be soft landing pads rather than brick walls. And while I could have recited a curriculum of my sacrifices like inventory at a closing sale, I instead brewed a second pot, opened the window to let in the kind of breeze that smells like cut grass and second chances, and thought about how my own mother had once told me that love without boundaries is a soup without salt, easy to swallow and impossible to remember. The practical work began after noon, because the world insists on paperwork even when hearts are breaking, so I called the registrar not to plead but to confirm, navigated the hold music with the patience of a saint I do not claim to be, and made sure the account change was not reversible by any well-meaning bystander with a password and a guilty conscience. Then I moved through the bank steps like a figure skater tracing old routines, shifting funds to a place that carried my name alone, setting alerts that would ding in my pocket not with drama, but with the cool certainty of numbers behaving, and each confirmation email felt like a brick laid into a path I should have paved years ago if I had not been so busy smoothing the pebbles under her feet. When she switched tactics from anger to sugar, offering to stop by for lunch and laugh about last night, and maybe we could plan a shopping trip for some work clothes since interviews require polish, I nearly softened. Because the muscle memory of rescuing is the strongest muscle in a mother's body. Yet I looked at the jacket still hanging on the back of the dining chair with the envelope no longer inside, and I pictured her hands this morning unfolding the card and the way the two words must have landed like a cold slap from the ocean, and I steadied myself by washing the breakfast dishes slowly, letting the hot water remind me that comfort is not the same as kindness, and that easy is not the same as good. By late afternoon she was outside. I could tell by the urgent buzz of the doorbell pressed 3 times in a row, a rhythm learned in childhood that used to mean scraped knees and now translated to scraped pride. And I stood in the hallway where the light makes a stripe across the floor like a finish line, and I did not open the door even when she called my name with the bright patience reserved for customer service disputes, because opening would have restarted the old film in which I play fixer and she plays victim, and I have grown allergic to reruns, so I let her words pool on the porch and, after they ran dry, I slid the envelope I had prepared earlier under the door with the kind of care you reserve for fragile things. An envelope that did not hold cash or a rescue plan or a printed apology, but a printed list titled, in very small letters, places currently hiring within bus distance, each listing marked with the schedule, the manager's name, and the instruction to mention me. Because I had called ahead, a quiet revenge that tasted cleaner than any speech and felt, in my chest, like justice softened with mercy. I did not answer the first call or the 5th or the 20th, because answering would have given her a shape to push against, and I wanted her to feel the shape of consequences instead. So I let the phone keep up its frantic little parade while the coffee drip stuttered and the morning news muttered from the television about rents rising and internships not paying and parents sending care packages stuffed with nostalgia, and I thought about how many nights I had counted tips in the pantry with my shoes still on because sitting down meant not getting back up, and how many forms I had filled out with the kind of concentration people associate with bomb squads. Because financial aid is just a different kind of wiring that demands you sweat and hold your breath and pray you cut the right line first. By the time sunlight made a half-hearted appearance through the kitchen blinds, the missed calls had stacked like crooked books, and the first message arrived with the kind of punctuation people use when they mean business, but forgot their manners, telling me that the tuition portal was acting strange and that her payment history had disappeared and that the landlord would not hold her apartment past Friday without verification of the next term, and then another message followed in which she mentioned that friends were planning a celebratory trip that weekend and it would be embarrassing to explain why she could not book, and I stood there, mug warming my hands, and let the words pass through me like rain through a screen. Not because I enjoyed her panic, but because panic is sometimes the only honest language entitlement understands when it runs out of applause. What people never tell you about raising a child mostly alone is that the ledger you keep is not just money and minutes, it is also dignity surrendered in little receipts. The field trip you chaperoned after a double shift where you smiled through the smell of cafeteria pizza because your kid wanted you there. The winter coat bought on clearance in August, because that is when the good sizes hide. The dentist appointments negotiated like hostage trades with an office that wants a card on file. You hope will clear, and as I listened to my voicemail convert her voice into text with the accuracy of a gossip columnist, I felt the old ache of being measured by people who only show up for the ribbon cutting. And I reminded myself that I had not chosen silence to hurt her. I had chosen it because the truth needed room to speak without my voice softening it into a lullaby she could ignore. Around mid-morning the relatives kicked in like a chorus line that had been waiting for their cue, each with a take dressed in concern but hemmed with accusation, telling me that the dinner scene had been unfortunate, but I should not take things so personally. That a young woman finding herself says dramatic things and that mothers should be soft landing pads rather than brick walls, and, while I could have recited a curriculum of my sacrifices like inventory at a closing sale, I instead brewed a second pot, opened the window to let in the kind of breeze that smells like cut grass and second chances, and thought about how my own mother had once told me that love without boundaries is a soup without salt, easy to swallow and impossible to remember. The practical work began after noon, because the world insists on paperwork even when hearts are breaking, so I called the registrar not to plead but to confirm, navigated the hold music with the patience of a saint I do not claim to be, and made sure the account change was not reversible by any well-meaning bystander with a password and a guilty conscience. Then I moved through the bank steps like a figure skater tracing old routines, shifting funds to a place that carried my name alone, setting alerts that would ding in my pocket not with drama, but with the cool certainty of numbers behaving, and each confirmation email felt like a brick laid into a path I should have paved years ago if I had not been so busy smoothing the pebbles under her feet. When she switched tactics from anger to sugar, offering to stop by for lunch and laugh about last night, and maybe we could plan a shopping trip for some work clothes since interviews require polish, I nearly softened. Because the muscle memory of rescuing is the strongest muscle in a mother's body. Yet I looked at the jacket still hanging on the back of the dining chair with the envelope no longer inside, and I pictured her hands this morning unfolding the card and the way the two words must have landed like a cold slap from the ocean, and I steadied myself by washing the breakfast dishes slowly, letting the hot water remind me that comfort is not the same as kindness, and that easy is not the same as good. By late afternoon she was outside. I could tell by the urgent buzz of the doorbell pressed 3 times in a row, a rhythm learned in childhood that used to mean scraped knees and now translated to scraped pride. And I stood in the hallway where the light makes a stripe across the floor like a finish line, and I did not open the door even when she called my name with the bright patience reserved for customer service disputes, because opening would have restarted the old film in which I play fixer and she plays victim, and I have grown allergic to reruns, so I let her words pool on the porch and, after they ran dry, I slid the envelope I had prepared earlier under the door with the kind of care you reserve for fragile things. An envelope that did not hold cash or a rescue plan or a printed apology, but a printed list titled, in very small letters, places currently hiring within bus distance, each listing marked with the schedule, the manager's name, and the instruction to mention me. Because I had called ahead, a quiet revenge that tasted cleaner than any speech and felt, in my chest, like justice softened with mercy. By early evening the counter on my lock screen looked like a scoreboard after a lopsided game. The missed calls stacked into neat little rows that made my stomach do the slow roll it used to do in the break room when the manager pinned the schedule and my name had been moved without warning. Yet, even as the numbers climbed and the tone of the voicemails slid from brittle outrage to syrupy reason to a kind of shaky politeness people reserve for bank tellers and nurses, I kept the phone face down on the kitchen table and moved through the house with the steady rhythm of someone who has finally remembered that boundaries are not a luxury item, but a basic utility, something you pay for on time or the lights go out. When she found the envelope I had slid under the door and recognized that the list was not a prank or a lecture, but a line of real places that would trade hours for money. The group thread must have lit up like a slot machine because within minutes the word manipulative appeared twice, once with a spelling that could not pass a freshman quiz and once with more punctuation than necessary. And a cousin I have not seen since the barbecue where he borrowed my cooler and never returned it wrote that I was crushing a young woman's momentum just when she should be networking, as if the only viable network were a champagne flute and the sound of your own voice bouncing off rooftop glass. And while I could have typed a paragraph about momentum built on other people's labor, I used my hands for something useful and opened my laptop instead, because if we are counting networks, then I, too, have one. The first call went to the phone carrier, the weary-voiced woman on the other end confirming that yes, the extra line on my account could be paused without penalty and reactivated any time. And when she apologized for the inconvenience, I told her this was not an inconvenience, but a reset, which made her laugh softly in the way women laugh when they recognize a battlefield without needing coordinates. And then I asked the car insurance to remove the young adult driver who believes fender benders are a moral hazard invented by mechanics, not as punishment, but as a fair exchange since the premium has been punishing me for years. And finally, I opened statements for the cards where her subscription trials had somehow ripened into monthly commitments no one remembered approving, the wellness box and the workout app, and the streaming service that promises wisdom through pretty cinematography. And I canceled each one with the patient precision of someone removing splinters from a thumb. Because every tiny sting adds up when you are trying to hold a life together. Before anyone decides this was cruelty, let me say that I left a bridge standing, a sturdy one, because I called the library where the manager still knows my name from the summers the first signed her up for reading challenges she never finished, and explained that a bright young woman needed a desk and a routine and a boss who would enforce both with a clock and a quiet nod rather than a lecture, and by the time I hung up there was a starting date on paper, a bus route highlighted with a pen that bleeds through cheap paper, and a promise that if she showed up on time for 2 weeks they would train her on the circulation desk, which is customer service, without the tip jar, and a perfect crash course in remembering that good manners are a currency accepted everywhere. Meanwhile, the digital echo chamber kept roaring as if volume equals virtue, her friends posting photographs from last night with captions about glowing up and outgrowing and the power of boundaries. Their boundaries being the ones that keep criticism out while letting applause in, and there she was in the center thread, writing that her path had been cell-made from the day she could walk, and that some people were best loved from a distance, which is rich coming from someone whose rent has been paid from a distance so long the distance might as well be a second job title, and still I did not respond because words typed into the public square are pearls tossed to pigeons, shiny and foot-pecked and ultimately wasted. So instead I printed the job schedule, folded it into an envelope with 2 bus day passes and a sandwich gift card I could not remember buying, and left the package on the porch with a note that said this is not a trap, it is a start, which felt less like revenge and more like a clean correction written in ink that does not smudge. Around dusk the rhythm of the call shifted into a beat I recognized from the years when she would ring 3 times after practice to announce she was safe, only this time the 4th ring stretched into voicemail, and the voicemail stretched into something else entirely. Because the voice that came through the speaker was not the one armed with public bravado and borrowed phrases about independence. It was thin around the edges and rushed in the middle, the sound of someone running while pretending to stroll, and she said she had visited the bursar, and they had confirmed a change she could not reverse without me, that the landlord had asked for employment verification in 30 days or a guarantor who would sign again, and that friends had gone quiet in the group chat once she stopped promising weekends of rooftop views and began asking for a couch. Then she paused and said one more line in a smaller voice that does not match her wardrobe or her performances, a line I will not repeat here because I listened to it twice and then again, and then set the phone down like it contained a live wire, and in the silence that followed I realized that this was the first time in years her words had reached me without bouncing off a wall of my own explanations, and that the lesson, if it was going to work, would have to keep working for a little while longer, right up until I decide what to do with the sentence that made me hit replay. The voicemail that made me stop was not the one where she performed apology like a monologue with too much lighting, and not the one where she tried to bargain with future holidays and a theoretical grandchild whose name she dangled like a coupon, but the one where her breath came fast between words and she said, in a tone I remembered from the first time she fell off a bicycle and realized the ground was not soft just because she was small, that she did not think she knew how to earn it, and that she was scared of a world that does not clap when you arrive but waits, arms crossed, to see whether you last. And then she added, almost as a throwaway, that she had said what she said at dinner because she thought it would make the people who pay the loudest pay attention. And that line hit me with the slow, heavy weight of a box you thought was empty until you lift it and feel the truth inside shift and settle. So I played it again, and then once more, letting the words work on me the way strong cleaner works into a stain you had learned to live with. I did what I always do when my heart is louder than logic, which is to write until the noise sorts itself into steps. So I made a list that began with what I would not do: no rush transfers, no patching over, no texting at midnight to undo a day of silence. And then shifted to what I could do without recruiting the old rescuer who wears my face, and that list looked, on paper, like a lesson plan, which felt crass and strangely correct because for years I wrote checks like extra credit and called it love. So I decided to give her a syllabus instead, a structure with dates and requirements and consequences that were not punishments so much as gravity returning to its post. And I called the bursar again to ask whether payments could be placed on institutional hold with release conditions baked into the account notes, and the clerk, who sounded like a woman who had seen every variety of family arrangement cross her desk, said that while there is no official feature called Earn It, there is a way to mark an account with third-party authorization that only clears after verification of employment hours submitted by the student. And I stood at my kitchen counter and felt something like justice fit into place with the audible click of a cabinet finally hung straight. It would have been easy to feel triumphant, so I did not let myself enjoy it, and instead I went to the landlord's office during lunch when the building manager's door stays open because the microwave in the back makes everything smell conversational. And I explained that I would not be renewing the guarantor's signature past 30 days, but that I was leaving a 1-month credit paid today that would release on the 1st if and only if an employment letter with hours attached arrived by the previous afternoon. And the manager, a woman with a tidy desk and a scar across her knuckle that tells you she has done things that never make it into resumes, said she respected a boundary with teeth, then printed a receipt that stated the condition in simple language too plain to wiggle around, and I folded it into a paper I was beginning to assemble in my head, a packet I would title syllabus because humor, like salt, keeps truth from turning bland. On my way home I stopped at the library because places that smell like paper always clear my thoughts, and I thanked the manager for holding the schedule I had requested, then asked whether the start date could be moved forward by a week if a certain applicant showed up with a list of references and a pair of sober shoes. And the manager smiled the secret smile librarians give each other when the world still works according to rules printed on walls, and said that showing up on time and clean clothes has been setting people apart for a century. And I left the branch with a printed schedule, a copy of the clock and policy, and a pen that says read more in cheerful blue letters, which I slipped into the front pocket of a binder I would fill that evening with bus routes, a simple budget, and a printed copy of every subscription she no longer needed with a blank line after each for initialing. Because sometimes accountability looks like handwriting. As I built the packet at the dining table where we once did math worksheets with raisins as counters, I remembered my own mother, who loved me in casseroles and questions and once said that the hardest door a parent ever closes is the door that keeps the wind off a child they have trained not to bring a coat. And I felt the ache under my sternum and kept going, because grief is not proof you are wrong. It is proof you are awake, and when the binder felt complete, I slid into the back sleeve a final page that explained, in 2 paragraphs, a financial aid office would admire that the next term's tuition had been moved to a holding account in her name and would release upon demonstration of 90 days of continuous work, no exceptions, with a note at the bottom that read, I believe you can do this even if you do not yet, which was the closest thing to a lullaby I could afford. I set the binder on her porch after dark with a knock that belonged to a neighbor delivering a borrowed dish, then stood in the shadow of the maple tree and watched the door open and her hand reach down and the binder vanish inside like a magic trick reversed. And I did not stay for the reaction because surveillance is a cousin of control and I am trying to retire from both. So I went home and washed my face and told myself that I had chosen a path I would not step off for pleading or threats. Or nostalgia, and then the phone buzzed with the alert tone the bank uses for external deposits, and there on the screen sat a notification that a transfer had landed from a familiar name with a memo line that said for last night and future. And my breath caught at the double insult folded into that sentence, because money with a caption is always a performance, and revenge that arrives in deposits wears a nice suit, and before I could decide whether to be angry or amused, another message arrived. This one a photograph of her holding the binder open to the last page with the words blurred by what looked like tears or rain, followed by a single sentence that read, "I declined the library because I got something better." And while my phone still warmed in my hand, a third text slid in from an unknown number with a firm signature at the bottom saying we should talk about reinstating the guarantor before Friday, which is when the real clock starts, and I sat very still. Because dangling in those words was a decision I had promised myself I would not compromise, and the revenge I had planned was suddenly staring at me like a mirror that talks back. The unknown number that signed itself with a crisp title and a confident suggestion about reinstating the guarantor before Friday landed like a salesman's polished shoe in my doorway. And although I knew exactly whose orbit produces people who speak in calendar threats and smooth vowels, I set the phone down and opened the binder's last page again, not because I needed reassurance about the policy I had built out of patience and old receipts, but because reading words I had chosen when calm felt like holding a railing on a moving train, and while I stood there the second message arrived from her own number with a photo of glossy onboarding paperwork spread across a cafe table, a latte grieving under too much foam, and a caption that said she had found something better, by which she meant a job that pays in networking and promise, and the kind of titles that look good in bios even when the paycheck requires a magnifying glass, which is to say she meant a favor from the same circle that applauded her performance at dinner, and the part of me that knows exactly how that circle writes checks with other people's pens stepped forward with the old ache, the rescuer ready to tidy the mess so she could stride toward the next one. Yet I told that part to go sit in the other room for a while, because today did not belong to her. I drove to the bank with the clarity that only a printed plan can deliver and returned the transfer stamped for last night and future with a polite note that said gifts attached to narratives are not gifts at all. Then I sent the bursar the signed authorization form we had discussed with the line about release upon 90 days of continuous work written in language so plain no one could pretend not to read it. And I walked to the landlord's office, the printed receipt I had demanded, the one that said the credit would sit very still until an employment letter did the knocking, and when I came home I placed copies of those pages in the binder's back sleeve, because paper, unlike people, does not revise its memory in the middle of an argument. And on top of the stack, I added a smaller sheet that listed 3 options for health insurance through the marketplace with a note that I would cover exactly 1 premium for exactly 1 month if she brought me a payroll stub dated within the next 30 days, a revenge so tidy it felt like housekeeping rather than combat, and while the printer hummed I thought about how many women I know who confuse chaos with love and how easy it is to mistake noise for proof that you care. And I promised myself for the 1000th time that my daughter would not inherit that misunderstanding from me if I could help it. In the afternoon, I walked past the restaurant that had hosted our little tragedy and thanked the server who had pretended not to hear the ugly parts. And I left an envelope for the manager with a note explaining that someone at our table had learned something that night, and it was not the person who gave the speech. Then I stood by the window and watched a new set of families take photographs near the host stand where all hope looks flattering, and as I turned away I saw a young woman in black flats carrying a stack of dessert menus across the floor with the careful seriousness of someone who has chosen to be good at a small job before asking for a larger one, and for a moment I imagined my daughter wearing that same expression. The one that says I am not too grand to begin, and a ridiculous lump rose in my throat because imagining her choosing to start where the floor still smells like lemon oil felt more tender than anything she had said to me in months. Back home the day had the hush of an auditorium before a matinee, and I set the phone on the counter and allowed myself one rehearsal of the call I would not make. Hearing my own voice explain that I had moved the next term's tuition to a holding account with her name on it, and that it would release without fanfare the moment she could show me 90 days of work without vanishing for long weekends that erased whole weeks. And in this rehearsal, I also told her that the binder was not a punishment but a door, and that the words earn it were not a verdict but a map, and that while love will always open my porch light at 2 in the morning if she knocks with something broken in her hands and blood on her knees, love would not be answering campus billing questions at midnight anymore. Yet practice is not performance, so I pressed the thought flat and slid it under the pile with the other pages, because silence was still the plan, and I am better at plans than apologies. Twilight came with the cicadas and a small knock that did not belong to delivery or neighbor or fundraiser, a two-beat knock she used as a child when she wanted to be let into the bathroom purely to chat while I did my makeup. And I stood in the hallway and waited until the third knock arrived, not to be cruel, but to be sure that eagerness had learned patience, and when I opened the door she stood on the porch in those glossy interview shoes that pinch by hour 2, mascara skidding into soft shadows under eyes that do not sleep well among people who talk about limitless potential and forget to wash mugs, and she held the binder with the page on top, the one with the 90 days printed like a dare. And she took a breath that swelled the air between us and said that her something better wanted a guarantor, and that the man with the crisp title said it would all be temporary until the next round of funding. And she wanted to know whether I would sign just this once because image matters. At the beginning, and while she spoke there was a flash of the girl who used to ask whether ladybugs count as pets if you name them, and I felt the answer I wanted to give rise like a tide, the easy yes that keeps the porch light burning. Yet I also saw the graduation room again, its careful glass, and the eyes that slid away from mine when the speech turned me into a prop, and I thought about what children learn from public theater and private rescue, and I realized I had reached the turn-in. The story where revenge becomes a boundary you can live with tomorrow. I told her that I would not sign and I would not call, that I would not negotiate with men whose titles arrive ahead of them like honor guards, that what I would do was keep the credit sitting with the landlord like a sealed jar and keep the tuition waiting where it could be reached by a person who has touched a time clock enough times to make a rhythm out of it. And before the anger could bloom I added that I had called ahead to the library and that the schedule could still shift forward if she walked in tomorrow in shoes that would be boring to photograph and a shirt that buttons without a slogan, and that I would meet her after her second shift with a bag of takeout and a paper form for the marketplace and a pen that promises nothing. And she stared at me with a look I have not earned in years, which is to say she looked at me like a wall that will not fall just because you lean beautifully, and she nodded once as if sealing a pact with herself rather than me, and she turned and left the porch without the dramatic flourish she usually rehearses in front of mirrors. I closed the door and sat on the floor in the dark because sometimes you have to let your bones settle before you move again, and the phone, that tyrant of modern loyalty, hummed on the counter with a fresh line of messages from numbers that wanted to manage optics and expedite signatures and make everyone behave like a happy brochure, and I let it hum until the battery confessed fatigue, because silence, like interest, grows when you let it compound, and in the quiet I could almost hear the tiny mechanical click of a bus pass being fed into a slot, and I decided that if she chose the library I would never tell her about the tuition waiting in the wings like an understudy, because love should not audition for credit. And if she chose the glossy company instead I would keep the binder, the porch light, and my silence, which is heavier than applause and more honest than a speech, and when I finally stood to make tea I saw that I had typed a draft reply without noticing a single sentence. That said I am here when you are earning, and I watched my finger hover over send for a long, slow breath before I did the kindest thing I could manage, which was to select all and press delete, leaving the screen clean and the ending open. Because sometimes a mother's loudest lesson is the one no one hears.